Well, good afternoon. My name is Terry Gray, working with World Vision Canada in Toronto. And within the World Vision Partnership, we, as World Vision Canada, have been able to get involved in some DIBs, very, very early stage. But we have had some lessons that, certainly would like to share with you this afternoon. Some of the challenges that, I want to share with you is, first of all, the early challenges from our perspective. And I should point out that although it mentions INGO perspective, this really is a World Vision experience, and it's based on just our limited organization, and more specifically even World Vision Canada. Then the INGO, or World Vision's value proposition, this may be a little bit broader than World Vision, and we can discuss it afterwards. And the possibilities that for collaboration also with various stakeholders who are involved with DIBs. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have some discussion and comments. One of the challenges that we've had internally within World Vision is to figure out what is the working relationship we want with an intermediary. Certainly, I think we all know that there's certain intermediaries, and perhaps less than a handful, who have got substantial roots, both with SIBs and DIBs. But as we begin to work with them and to have discussions with them, one of the questions we have internally, one of the challenges we have is, what do we turn over to an intermediary? What responsibilities do we want an intermediary to have? And what do we want as far as World Vision's involvement in as what would be classically the intermediary's role? Now, part of the challenge that we have internally and why we're asking this question, it has to do somewhat to our size as well. We're a fairly large NGO, but we really need to weigh out what's critical for us to take on and what is critical perhaps for somebody from outside to be able to take on. So some of the early challenges, and I guess what's important to know is that in most of the intermediaries that we've spoken to, we share common DIB objectives. This just lists some of them. Certainly, the reason that we want to get involved with DIBs is because of the increased effectiveness it has on our projects, and be able to scale up using data, using evidence-based information to be able to scale programs up. And then certainly, we also want to begin to look more at an outcome, looking more at an impact level, and moving away from perhaps more of our activity and output-focused projects. And then we also, and this is one that I guess is important to us, of course, but what I've really noted from all of the intermediaries that we've talked with, there also is that focus on vulnerable communities and marginalized groups. And if we internally have had discussions on certain areas, it's been, if we move into SIBs and DIBs, will we still be able to focus on these areas? And certainly in our discussions with various intermediaries, that certainly has been the case. And then provide the right incentives, of course, to all stakeholders. We've talked about that at some length today. So just to give you some of the challenges that we've had, and working again with an intermediary and trying to decide whether or not an intermediary or World Vision would be best placed. Some of it has to do with just data collection. And part of the thing we need to understand is, as an INGO, we have country offices in various countries throughout the world, and certainly in those countries where we'd be doing a DIB. We usually have we do have strong relationships with the government in those countries, and we usually, of course, with the specific ministry or the department that we would be working with. We also have strong relations with the community and with others in those areas, and with other NGOs. When we did go out and we did a cost-effective analysis for a program earlier this year, late last year, earlier this year, certainly there was a challenge in getting information and to get data. Part of it, though, I don't think necessarily was just because It was World Vision asking for it. I think we had good relationships with the different government administrations and with other NGOs who had that information. The challenge is it's just hard to get good data, especially in some countries. And that comes from, it may come from more than just one ministry, maybe two, maybe three different ministries that you need to collect information from, but also maybe other stakeholders as well. Then analyzing historical baselines. Of course, that requires a certain analysis that, again, this is one of the questions we're asking ourselves internally. Is this something that we want to have someone from outside to work with us on, or can we and do we want to build the capacity within the organization? Certainly choosing the target population, that's one of the areas that we see ourselves, having been working in these different countries, we see ourselves taking on for ourselves, and then certainly analyzing the performance of our own projects and others. We use external evaluators for that and would hire consultants in those cases. And then conducting analysis necessary to develop the evaluation methodology. Again, an area that we question whether we should be building our own capacity or using a consultant and bringing them in to help us in those cases. So looking at then the feasibility studies, this is one of the areas that we want to build our own capacity, and I think a decision has been made within our organization that doing the cost-benefit analysis at the beginning of the project, looking at the feasibility and the model payments, and then actually developing the cash flow. Those are areas that in the past we certainly have not been as much involved in, but that is an area of capacity that we do see ourselves wanting to develop. So that's been a decision that we have moved forward with. In part, we've made that decision because when we've talked to others, either consultants or intermediaries, our sense is that they haven't taken it far enough and looking more at the economic modeling and also at the social stakeholders analysis. I'm not going to talk a lot about that now because later in the presentation I do bring it up again. And then the project design. I mean, these are challenges that certainly we look to consultants and others who have gone through this, to work with us. But just defining what the social outcomes are going to be, and then setting the targets and the metrics for that in the evaluation process, and then properly valuing the outcomes of interest as well. I think we've talked about that quite a bit today. I think we know a lot of the challenges around that. When it comes to contract negotiation, I mean, this is certainly one of the areas that we certainly would want to have a consultant or an intermediary if we could negotiate with them on the different roles and the role that they could play with us. This is an area we certainly feel we don't have the capacity internally, and we don't see ourselves necessarily having it in the short run either. And then, just listing some of the things there, negotiating the payment terms. Raising the private capital, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but then developing operation procedures, and then I guess especially in drafting up the contract that would be associated with the DIB as well. And then selection of and the negotiation with the independent evaluator. And then the final one would be looking at the implementing and monitoring. And I think we've talked about this at some length today, so I won't go into more detail. So just looking now at what we see as being some of the value proposition that we bring, and that I think an INGO would bring as well, some of the larger INGOs certainly, would be in the project financing, and then looking, as I mentioned already, in the feasibility study, monitoring and evaluation, and then promoting lessons learned. So one of the areas that's been very interesting to our organization, being a large organization, we do have a substantial number of high net worth individuals who give to the organization. We also are recognizing that high net worth individuals, family businesses, family foundations are becoming very interested in impact investing. We're beginning to work within our organization to actually begin to provide products to these groups that would be of much more interest, perhaps, than what we have in the past. We're only at the beginning of this phase. We're only exploring it right at the moment, but we certainly see the possibility of having a risk capital fund that we could develop within the organization itself. The other thing that we've learned is that a lot of the corporates who we're working with really can play different roles. Now, as World Vision Canada, we've tended to work with the extractive sector over the past number of years. And we see that the possibility of them playing an investor role is when we've discussed with some of the DIB possibilities we have. There was the possibility of investor. They could be the project outcome payer, and they also could be an investment guarantor also. The other thing that, depending on the sector, we've talked to the extractive sector in a couple of different ways. Malaria we talked about this morning in Mozambique. TB is another one. And one thing that may surprise you, may not, is that how much some of these companies have invested into these different sectors and how much they can contribute, even as a service provider as well. I guess the final value proposition that I see us having, or no, not the final one, the second to last, is looking at the feasibility studies. And I mentioned before, we see ourselves becoming much more involved in doing the cost-benefit analysis and cost-effective analysis. We also see ourselves wanting to do a much more integrated approach. So being able to bring together not only the financial analysis, but also the economic analysis and stakeholder analysis, so that we can begin to have an analysis that is in one model and that we can use, we think, much more effectively. And then we, looking at analyzing the value of alternative project designs and financing arrangements are just going to be critical to us as we move forward. And then lastly, just being able to measure the risk also from different alternative viewpoints. And this is one of the areas in the little bit of work that we've done already with DIBS, being able to look at it from the investor's point of view, from the outcome payer's point of view, as well as from the service delivery, really becomes important when you want to begin to look at different incentives for different groups. I guess the last area is, I mentioned the bond report here and the payment by results that came out and that I read a couple of weeks ago. When I went through that, one of the things that was my conclusion was I didn't necessarily agree with that, but then of course I was looking through my lens as a larger NGO as well. What I think we really need, and one of the things within World Vision that we're considering as well, is how can we have be able to provide lessons learned for those who are looking at DIBS, and how can we be more strategic? Obviously, this would be a forum that we're having here right now, but looking at purposely how we can be more intentional about that. And then I'll leave it now just for some comments and questions. I realize that there's many other international NGOs who are here who may have a different perspective, and certainly would welcome that, and would certainly be open to ideas too, because in those areas that I mentioned about collaboration, whether or not that's an area that, whether it's looking at how we develop risk capital funds, how we develop new tools for feasibility studies, or others, or even just M&E prospects, perhaps how more collectively we can be working on those things together. So I'll leave it open to comments and questions.